At dinner, my son humiliated me in front of his wife, but that night at the table was only the beginning. What followed set off a chain of events no one could have predicted, filled with surprising choices and unforgettable moments that changed everything for our family. What happened next will unfold in ways you'd never imagine, and you truly won't believe where it all leads. Don't forget to subscribe and comment where you are watching from. The evening had begun so simply, the way so many family dinners do. A warm table, the comforting aroma of roasted chicken, and a bottle of wine breathing softly on the counter. I had set the table with care, not out of necessity but out of habit, because when you've lived 67 years and spent decades as a husband, a father, and later a widower, the rituals matter. They are the little things that bring order to the chaos of life. My son Michael and his wife Clara had come over, and I had looked forward to sharing a meal that would remind me of what family still meant. I had imagined laughter echoing through the dining room, perhaps a story or two about their week, and maybe a chance to share some wisdom the way fathers always hope to do. But the reality was far different. Michael sat there, across the table, his posture stiff, his tone clipped, his words sharp enough to wound. He said something that cut me down in front of Clara, something that struck not only at my dignity but at the years of sacrifice I had poured into his life. I will not repeat the exact words here just yet, because what matters is not the insult itself but the feeling it left behind. It was the sting of humiliation, and worse, it was humiliation delivered by the very person I had once carried in my arms, the boy I had raised with every ounce of strength I had after his mother passed away. I held my fork still, my appetite dissolving, though I forced a small smile for Clara's sake. She looked uneasy, perhaps embarrassed, but Michael carried on, oblivious to the sting of his words. He thought he was clever. He thought he was making a point. What he did not realize was that in those few seconds he was chiseling away at something far greater than my pride. He was chiseling away at my trust. You see, the story I'm telling you is not just about one dinner. It is about years of choices, of sacrifices, of payments made not only in dollars but in sweat, in sleepless nights, in the silent determination to give my son the life he deserved. From the day his mother passed, I had taken on the weight of two parents, and I carried it willingly. I funded his education, I supported his first car, I even helped him when he bought his first home. Most recently, I had been covering payments that gave him and Clara the comfort of stability. These were not debts, they were gifts of love, an extension of everything I believed a father should do. And yet here I sat, at my own table, made small by the very child I had given everything for. The food lost its flavor. The warmth of the room turned cold. The clock ticked on, indifferent to my hurt. Michael's voice carried on as if nothing monumental had just happened, but inside me, something shifted. A line had been crossed. I will tell you this. I did not raise my voice that night. I did not slam my hand on the table or storm away in anger. Instead, I sat in silence, tasting the bitterness of betrayal. I looked at the man across from me, my son, and I realized that actions have consequences. He may not have known it then, but the consequence of that night would be something he never saw coming. Because sometimes the strongest response is not anger, but resolve. And my resolve was crystal clear. The payment he depended on was about to end, and with it, the lesson of a lifetime was about to begin. When people see a man in his late 60s, sitting quietly at his dinner table, they rarely stop to consider the journey that brought him there, but every wrinkle on my face and every gray strand in my hair tells a story of long days, restless nights, and sacrifices no one else ever witnessed. Because long before that fateful dinner, my life had been a pattern of giving, of working harder than I thought possible, all to build a future for my son. After losing my wife, I learned quickly that single parenthood was not a part-time job. It was a role that demanded everything: patience, resilience, and a willingness to take on burdens without complaint. So I worked mornings at the hardware store, stocking shelves before the sun rose. In the afternoons, I picked up hours driving delivery trucks across the county, and when the weekend came, I mowed lawns and fixed fences just to make sure there was a little extra tucked away. My hands were calloused and my back often stiff, but I kept moving, fueled by the vision of my son walking across a stage one day with a diploma in his hand and every door of opportunity open to him. That vision came at a cost, and I skipped vacations, drove the same old pickup long past its prime, turned down dinners with friends, and picked up extra shifts whenever I could. And each time I received a paycheck, I calculated bills, groceries, and tuition with the precision of a man balancing life on a tightrope, stretching soup and bread further than they should have gone. But I never let my son feel the scarcity, because to him the world appeared steady and full of possibility, since I had decided he would never carry the weight I did. When he reached college age, the tuition bills arrived like mountains on my doorstep, but I found a way, working overtime, repairing farm equipment on the side, dipping into the savings my wife and I had built before her illness. And when I saw him walk across that graduation stage, it was worth every sacrifice. My applause louder than anyone's, my palms aching, my eyes wet with tears, not only for what he had achieved, but for the battles I had fought quietly in the background to get him there. But graduation was not the end of my giving, because when he met Clara and they began planning a wedding, the expenses piled high, and though they were young and full of dreams, they were short on resources. So I stepped in again, paying deposits, catering costs, and even contributing to the rings, using money I had saved for retirement. And I told myself it was fine, because this was what fathers did. This was the moment every parent waited for, to see their child start a new chapter with everything they needed. When they moved into their first place together, the financial reality hit them harder than they expected, with rent steep and groceries costly. So once again I offered support, helping with bills, covering emergencies, keeping their fridge stocked whenever I visited, telling them it was temporary, just until they got on their feet, because I wanted them to build their life without being crushed under financial strain. What I did not say, but always felt, was that these acts were my way of still being part of their lives, my way of holding on to the bond we shared, because though my son had grown and married, my support, both financial and emotional, was the thread I believed kept us close, and I thought each check written, each bill paid, and each hour worked was a stitch in the fabric of a stronger relationship. Looking back, I can see how those years of sacrifice painted the backdrop for everything that would follow, and though I had no regrets about what I gave, I would soon discover that sometimes the most powerful lesson a parent teaches is not in what they provide, but in what they withhold. For the past 3 years, my role as a father had quietly transformed into something resembling a silent benefactor, because while my son and his wife were building their life together, I was the one footing nearly every bill that kept their household steady. And though I never spoke of it with pride or complaint, the truth was that I had become the unseen foundation holding up their world. Each month, I transferred money directly into their account, enough to cover the bulk of their mortgage, And I reminded myself that young couples needed time to find their footing in a world that often demanded more than it gave. When their car payment came due and their checking account balance was thin, I stepped in, writing a check before they ever had to worry about late fees or penalties. And when their credit card bills swelled with charges from furniture, clothes, or unexpected expenses, I found myself dipping into my own savings to keep their balances from spinning out of control. I even filled their pantry on more than one occasion, arriving with grocery bags stacked high, not because they asked, but because I could not bear the thought of them struggling while I still had something to give. Over time, this pattern became routine, almost ritual, and while they spoke of gratitude in polite terms now and then, it became clear that my support had shifted from occasional generosity to ongoing necessity. I told myself it was temporary, that 3 years was just a season, and soon they would stand firmly on their own. But as each month passed, my transfers, my checks, my quiet sacrifices were not replaced by their independence, but rather absorbed into the rhythm of their daily lives. I had essentially been funding their lifestyle, creating a cushion that shielded them from the harsh edges of adulthood, and while I did it out of love, I began to wonder if they even realized how much of their comfort came from the hours I still worked, from the retirement fund I slowly drained, from the nights I spent calculating whether I could afford both their needs and my own. The weight of that truth pressed against me, not as bitterness, but as a question that lingered in the back of my mind. What would happen if I stopped? The call came on a Thursday evening, just as I was settling into my armchair with a book and a cup of tea, and when I saw my son's name glowing on the screen, my heart lifted with a familiar mix of hope and worry, because it was not often that he phoned me directly, and his calls always carried a weight of importance. His voice was steady, almost rehearsed, as he asked if I would join him and Clara for dinner at an upscale restaurant in the city that weekend, saying there was something important we needed to discuss. And though his tone revealed little, my mind began weaving possibilities the moment we hung up. For years, I had been waiting for this kind of gesture, a moment when perhaps he would look across the table, meet my eyes, and say the words every father longs to hear, "Thank you." I imagined him acknowledging the years of work, the financial support, the sacrifices quietly made so he and Clara could have a smooth beginning. And perhaps he would assure me that my job was done, that he was ready to take the reins fully, to shoulder the responsibilities of husband, homeowner, and man of his own household. I let myself believe that maybe, at last, this dinner would mark a turning point, where my role could shift from provider to proud onlooker, where my son would step forward with independence, and I could finally relax without carrying the burden of his bills in my pocket. The thought made me smile as I closed my book, letting the tea grow cold because I could see it so clearly, the three of us sitting together, sharing laughter, and hearing him say he was ready to build his life without leaning on me. In the days that followed, I found myself preparing for the dinner as though it were a milestone, pressing my shirt, polishing my shoes, even rehearsing what I might say if he truly offered gratitude, because I wanted to respond with grace, to tell him that every penny and every hour had been worth it. My heart was light with anticipation, imagining this moment as a reward for years of sacrifice, the evening when my son would show me that my faith in him had not been misplaced. I thought of how proud his mother would have been to see him reach this point, how she would have smiled knowing he was ready to carry himself with dignity and independence, and I whispered a quiet prayer that night, thanking her memory for giving me the strength to keep going all these years. By Friday morning I was almost giddy with expectation, telling myself to be patient, to wait for the dinner, to let him speak in his own time, but still the scenarios played out in my mind, each one ending with a handshake, a hug, or a simple, heartfelt acknowledgement that he understood what I had given. I found myself straightening the house unnecessarily, ironing shirts I did not intend to wear, and polishing my old watch because I wanted to look my best for what I believed would be a pivotal evening. On Saturday afternoon, I drove into the city earlier than needed, leaving enough time to wander near the restaurant, soaking in the hum of traffic and the laughter of strangers on sidewalks. And as I stood there watching the sun dip between tall glass buildings, I thought how fitting it was that the setting for this conversation would be elegant, refined, and worthy of a new chapter. In my mind, I pictured the meal, the way Clara might smile warmly, the way my son's voice might tremble just a little as he spoke of responsibility and gratitude, and I thought of how I would answer, telling him he had made me proud and that it was now his time to lead. The hours of waiting were filled with restless energy, but beneath it all was a calm certainty that this was the moment, the culmination of years of sacrifice and patience, the turning point that would ease my heart and let me step back, knowing my son had finally grown into the man I always knew he could be. The evening of the dinner finally arrived, and I found myself driving through the city with a kind of nervous anticipation I had not felt in years. My hands resting on the steering wheel, as if steadying not just the truck, but my own emotions. Because this dinner had begun to feel like the moment I had waited for through decades of sacrifice and silent support. The restaurant was one of those establishments that glowed from the street, its tall windows framed with soft golden light, the kind of place where the sound of hushed conversation and the clink of crystal glasses floated into the night air, and as I parked the truck and walked toward the entrance, I could not help but think with a wry smile that the bill for this dinner would likely trace back to me, just as so many of their comforts had over the years. I straightened my jacket, brushed an invisible speck from my sleeve, and pushed open the heavy glass door. Immediately greeted by the fragrance of roasted meats, butter, and fine wine, the kind of scents that spoke of luxury I rarely indulged in for myself. The hostess greeted me with a polished smile, and when I gave my son's name, she led me through the restaurant, weaving between tables of couples laughing softly and businessmen leaning over contracts, until we arrived at a corner booth where Michael and Clara were already seated. They rose slightly as I approached, though not with the easy warmth I had imagined during my days of rehearsing, but with a kind of seriousness that seemed to settle over the table like a cloud. Clara offered a polite smile, though it did not quite reach her eyes, and Michael gestured for me to sit, his expression composed but distant, as though he had practiced this meeting as carefully as I had. Only his script was not one of gratitude, but of something more formal. Sliding into the booth, I felt the leather cool against my back, the flicker of the candle between us casting shadows that seemed almost too dramatic for a simple dinner, and I tried to push away the unease that had begun to stir inside me, reminding myself that perhaps seriousness was just his way of preparing to say something meaningful. The waiter arrived quickly, pouring water into tall glasses and reciting the specials with the cadence of a man who had done so 1,000 times before, and I nodded absently, my focus locked on my son and his wife, waiting for them to speak, waiting for the words I believed were finally coming. As menus were handed out, I let my gaze drift across the elegant print, the prices high enough to make most people pause, and I could not help but think again of the irony that this very meal, meant to celebrate or announce independence, was likely funded by the very accounts I had kept replenished. I studied my son across the flickering light, noticing how his hands rested on the table, fingers intertwined tightly, his jaw clenched. In a way I remembered from his childhood when he had something to say, but was unsure of how it would be received. And though my heart ached with anticipation, I told myself to be patient, to let him speak in his own time. Clara sat with her posture straight, her eyes shifting between us, her silence suggesting she was here not just as his partner, but as his witness. And I wondered if perhaps she had encouraged this meeting, urging him to finally acknowledge all that had been done for them. The room around us hummed with life, silverware chiming against plates, laughter spilling from nearby tables, the low notes of a piano drifting from somewhere near the bar. But to me, it all blurred into a kind of distant soundtrack, because every part of my attention was fixed on the two faces before me and the question that pulsed quietly inside. Would this be the evening where years of effort were recognized? Or would the weight of expectation fall once again into silence? As I lifted the menu and pretended to study the options, my heart beat steadily in my chest, carrying me toward the moment when their serious expressions would finally give way to words that I still believed would affirm that all my sacrifices had not gone unnoticed, that perhaps at last my son was ready to step fully into his own life without leaning on mine. The moment finally came when Michael set his menu down with deliberate care, folded his hands on the table, and fixed me with a look that carried none of the gratitude or warmth I had so carefully imagined during the days leading up to this dinner. And, as his voice cut through the quiet hum of the restaurant, I realized he had been preparing this speech long before I arrived. He began by telling me that Clara and he had been discussing certain concerns, that while they appreciated my involvement in their lives, there was an aspect of my presence that caused them embarrassment. And as he continued, the words fell like stones into my chest, heavy, sharp, impossible to ignore. He spoke of my old-fashioned ways, my modest habits, my frugality, describing them not as virtues, but as flaws that reflected poorly on them when they were out with friends or hosting gatherings. And he used the word cheap with a precision that made me feel as though he had rehearsed it in front of a mirror, testing its sting before unleashing it in public. Clara leaned forward then, her voice soft yet cutting, agreeing with his assessment and adding her own observations, noting how my car, a reliable but aging sedan, looked out of place in the driveway of their suburban neighborhood, how my clothes, neat but simple, did not match the style of the company they kept, and she even mentioned how, when I had taken them to dinner last month at a modest diner instead of a high-end place, she had cringed at what she called my lack of refinement. Each word struck like a lash, not because of its accuracy, but because of the intent behind it, the deliberate attempt to reduce a lifetime of work and sacrifice into a caricature of inadequacy. And I sat there frozen, my fork still in my hand, my heart pounding against my ribs as though trying to shield me from the blows. Around us, the restaurant continued its gentle symphony of laughter and clinking glasses, but at our table the air had grown dense with humiliation, and though no one else could hear the exact words, I felt the sting of being diminished, not just as a man, but as a father, in front of strangers who glanced curiously at my tightening face. Michael leaned back slightly, as if satisfied with the delivery of his speech, his eyes scanning me not with love or respect, but with the cold detachment of someone critiquing a presentation. And Clara reached for her wine glass, sipping delicately as though this confrontation were a routine matter, nothing more than a discussion of decor and appearances. My throat tightened as I forced myself to remain composed, telling myself that raising my voice or storming out would only feed into the picture they were painting, but inside I felt the fragile scaffolding of hope collapsing, the hope that this dinner would be about gratitude, about independence, about love. Instead, it was a lecture, a calculated display meant to belittle me into submission, to reshape me into something that matched their image, and I realized that the boy I had raised with every ounce of strength I had after his mother died was now a man who could sit across from me and call me an embarrassment without hesitation, as though the years of sacrifice were merely footnotes in a story he had already rewritten to suit himself. I swallowed hard, the food before me untouched, my mind a swirl of disbelief and the first prick of something sharper, something that would soon crystallize into the resolve that would carry me through what was to come. Michael cleared his throat after the sting of his earlier words had settled over the table like an invisible fog, and then he leaned forward with a gravity that made it clear he had saved the sharpest edge for last, his voice calm, measured, but carrying the weight of an ultimatum I never thought I would hear from my own child. He said that if I wanted to remain in their lives, if I wished to be present at their dinners, their social gatherings, their celebrations, I would need to upgrade my image, and the way he spoke of it, as though I were a piece of outdated furniture to be remodeled, pierced me more deeply than any insult could. He listed the conditions one by one, starting with my car, insisting that the old sedan I had driven faithfully for years was no longer acceptable, that I needed to purchase something more modern and luxurious, something sleek and expensive that would match the vehicles in their circle of friends. He moved on to my home, suggesting that my modest house in the quiet neighborhood where I had built a life with his mother was not suitable, that I should consider selling it and moving into a better area, somewhere that reflected the status he wanted people to associate with him and Clara. His eyes flicked briefly to my jacket and shirt, clothes I had pressed carefully that afternoon, and he said I needed to invest in finer suits, polished shoes, and accessories that would show I belonged in their company. Clara chimed in then, her voice carrying the final blow, saying softly but firmly that they could not have their friends seeing me as I was, that appearances mattered more than I realized, and if I wished to be part of their future, I would need to adapt. The words hung in the air between us, cold and immovable, and I felt a wave of silence roll over me, because though my ears heard their demands, my heart refused to accept that they were real. I had spent decades believing love was enough, that sacrifice and devotion built bonds stronger than wealth or clothing or cars, and yet here was my son, the boy I had held through sleepless nights, the young man I had worked 3 jobs to support through college, now telling me that my presence in his life was conditional upon my ability to purchase luxury. I sat motionless, my hands resting on the table, staring at the flickering candlelight that danced across the polished silverware, trying to ground myself in something solid as the world around me tilted. Other diners laughed and chatted around us, unaware that at this table a father was being told his worth could be measured in leather seats, designer fabrics, and postal codes. My mind flickered with images, not of the demands he now laid before me, but of the years I had bent my back and emptied my pockets to make sure he never lacked, and the cruel irony that he now asked me to discard the very values that had given him the foundation to sit here in this fine restaurant at all. The crushing blow was not just in the list of conditions, but in the realization that in his eyes I was not enough, as I was. That love, devotion, and sacrifice were invisible unless wrapped in the shine of wealth. I wanted to speak, to defend myself, to remind him of the countless moments that had shaped our journey, but the words caught in my throat, blocked by the sheer disbelief that such a demand could come from my own flesh and blood. So I remained silent. The echo of his ultimatum pounding in my head, the candle flickering between us like a witness to the fracture that had just opened in our family. I sat there in silence, the kind of silence that feels louder than any voice, my body rooted to the leather booth as though the weight of their words had pinned me in place, my fork lying untouched on the plate, while the candlelight flickered in front of me like a cruel reminder of how exposed I was under the gaze of strangers. My son's demands echoed in my mind, circling endlessly, his voice repeating that I must change my car, my clothes, my home, if I wanted to remain part of his life, and Clara's agreement layered on top like a final seal on a verdict I never imagined hearing. Around us, the restaurant continued its elegant rhythm, glasses clinking, cutlery chiming, laughter drifting across the polished room, yet I felt as though every sound was directed at me, as if every diner within sight had heard the ultimatum, and now stared with judgment, their eyes sliding over me like beams of light exposing all that Michael and Clara had called embarrassing. I felt heat rising in my face, not from anger, but from the deep sting of humiliation, the sense that I had been stripped of dignity in a public arena where I had once believed we would share joy. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the glass of water, but even the cool sip did little to wash away the bitter taste that had filled my mouth since his speech began. I tried to steady myself, to remind my heart to keep beating in rhythm, but inside I was unraveling, each thread of trust and love fraying as I tried to reconcile the son I had raised with the man sitting across from me, a man who spoke of image and appearances as though they mattered more than blood. My mind searched desperately for escape, for some thought to cling to that could ease the pressure building in my chest. Yet all I found were memories colliding with reality, images of his childhood, when he would run into my arms after school, his laughter filling our modest home, his tears drying on my shoulder after his mother's passing, and now the same boy, grown into a man, telling me I was unworthy of his company unless I became someone I was not. The humiliation deepened as I realized other diners were glancing toward our table, sensing tension, perhaps even catching fragments of words, and I felt the crushing awareness that my private shame had spilled into public view, making me not only a disappointed father, but a spectacle in the eyes of strangers. I forced my face into stillness, not wanting to give Michael the satisfaction of seeing me broken, but inside the storm raged, disbelief colliding with hurt, until I could no longer separate one from the other. And the silence I maintained was not strength but paralysis, the inability to respond when every instinct screamed to defend myself. I felt smaller with each passing second, the booth closing in around me, the weight of years of sacrifice pressing down harder as though mocking me for ever believing that love was enough to bind a family together. My heart whispered questions I could not voice. How had it come to this? How could he measure me in things I could buy rather than the life I had given him? How had the bond between father and son become so distorted that appearances mattered more than love? I sat frozen, staring at the flame of the candle as if it held the answers, while Michael leaned back casually, Clara sipping her wine as though they had merely concluded a business meeting, their composure sharp against the raw ache building within me. The silence stretched on, but it was not peace. It was the hollow emptiness of realization, the dawning truth that the people I loved most had placed a price tag on my presence, and I had nothing to offer but myself, a self they no longer valued. At last, when the weight of silence became unbearable and my chest felt tight from holding back words that refused to form, I excused myself quietly, pushing back from the booth with deliberate calm so as not to betray the storm raging inside me. And I walked toward the restroom with slow, measured steps, each one carrying the heaviness of disbelief that such a conversation had unfolded in the very place I had expected gratitude. The hallway was dimmer than the dining room, lined with framed photographs of vineyards and candle-lit tables, and the muted hum of laughter and music followed me until I turned a corner where the muffled sounds of conversation began to filter through the air vents from the main dining room. I entered the restroom, splashed cold water on my face, and stared into the mirror, studying the man who looked back at me. A man whose hands were still wet from labor, whose shirt was pressed with care, whose eyes carried decades of sacrifice. And I whispered silently that I would hold myself together, that I would not let them see me unravel. But as I stepped out, moving back down the hallway, I slowed at the sound of familiar voices drifting through the thin barrier of the corridor. Voices I recognized instantly, voices belonging to the very people I had just left at the table. My son's voice was clear, carrying a sharp, amused tone I had not heard since his mischievous youth. Only now it was not innocent play but cruel satisfaction, and he said something that made my blood run cold. "Did you see the old man's face? He looked like he had been punched in the gut." Clara laughed then, a soft, cruel laugh that echoed in my ears. And she added that it was almost too easy, that with a few carefully chosen words they could steer me into doing anything, and they would just have to put up with me a little longer while I kept the money flowing. Michael responded with something that felt like a dagger, saying that they would milk me for a few more years, just until they were fully comfortable, and then it would be time to cut contact and live their lives free of my presence. Their laughter overlapped after that, light, carefree, as though they had just shared a private joke, and the sound of it twisted in my chest like a tightening rope, squeezing the air from my lungs. I stood frozen in the hallway, my back pressed against the cool wall, my mind racing to comprehend what I had just heard, the clarity of their voices leaving no room for misunderstanding. It was not speculation or paranoia. It was truth spoken plainly, carelessly, by the very people I had dedicated my life to supporting. And I felt the ground beneath me shift as the foundation of love and trust I had built cracked open to reveal manipulation and greed. The hallway suddenly seemed longer, darker, as though the building itself had swallowed me into its shadow, and I felt an ache in my chest that was not just pain but awakening. The cold realization that everything I had assumed about this dinner, about my place in their lives, about the bond we shared, was an illusion carefully maintained for their benefit. I drew a slow breath, forcing myself to move, to walk back toward the dining room, though my steps felt heavy, each one carrying me closer to a table where I would now sit with eyes unclouded, seeing not the son and daughter-in-law I loved, but the strangers who had laughed at my pain. As I walked back toward the table, each step felt heavier than the last, the muted sounds of the restaurant wrapping around me like a blanket I could not escape, the clink of glasses and low hum of conversation mocking the storm raging inside my chest. And when I turned the corner and saw them again, seated together with composed faces and an ease that suggested nothing cruel had just passed between them, I understood in that instant that I was no longer returning to the same table, because I was no longer the same man who had risen from it moments earlier. My eyes lingered on Michael first, the boy I had carried in my arms when he was small, the young man whose hand I had shaken proudly at his graduation, the son I had believed would honor the sacrifices made in his name, And now all I could see was calculation behind his steady gaze, a man who had learned to use my love not as a bond but as leverage, shaping his words and actions to extract every last ounce of support until he no longer had need of me. Clara sat beside him with her elegant posture, her smile polite but practiced, and in her eyes I saw not the warmth of family but the sharp glint of ambition, a determination to mold every detail of their lives into the image she desired, even if it meant reshaping me into someone I could never be. The candle between us flickered as though sensing the shift in the air, its flame unsteady, and I lowered myself back into the booth slowly, my body present but my mind hovering just beyond, studying them with new vision no longer clouded by hope or the desperate longing for appreciation. I listened as Michael asked casually if I was feeling all right, his tone measured, as though rehearsed to mask the contempt I had overheard, and I realized then that every word, every gesture from this point forward would be filtered through the truth I had stumbled upon in that hallway, the truth that love was not the glue binding us together, but rather money, influence, and convenience. I nodded slightly, answering with the bare minimum, while inside my thoughts unraveled at rapid speed, piecing together years of interactions, connecting threads I had ignored, the subtle dismissals, the constant reliance on my support, the absence of genuine gratitude, and I understood now that what I had taken for immaturity or temporary dependence was something far more deliberate. They had seen me not as a father to cherish, but as a resource to exploit, a reservoir to be tapped until it ran dry, and their laughter, still echoing in my mind, confirmed that this had been their plan all along. My heart tightened as I thought of my late wife, of the promises I had whispered to her memory that I would raise our son with strength and love, that I would protect him and guide him, and I wondered what she would say if she could see us now, her husband sitting in silence across from a child who no longer valued the life lessons she and I had tried so hard to instill. The pain was sharp, but it was also clarifying, and as I studied the two of them across the table, I felt the final remnants of denial slipping away, replaced by a cold certainty that things could never return to the way they were. I stirred the water glass slowly, watching the ripples spread, and I told myself that while they saw me as weak, humiliated, and dependent on their approval, they did not realize the strength that comes from truth, the quiet power of a man who has finally removed the blindfold from his eyes. I thought of every bill I had paid, every dollar I had funneled into their comfort, every hour I had worked past my own limits, and rather than despair, I felt a strange calm settling over me, because now I knew exactly what I was dealing with, and clarity has a way of turning pain into resolve. They spoke on, shifting the conversation to light topics, as though the confrontation had never happened, as though they had not just revealed their disdain moments earlier, and I responded only with small nods, quiet affirmations, all the while committing every detail of their faces to memory, because I knew that this was the turning point, the night when I would stop seeing them as the center of my world and start seeing them for what they truly were. The realization was cold, yes, but it was also liberating, for in that coldness I discovered a fire that would guide me through what was to come, a fire they did not yet know had been lit. When I returned to the table, I carried myself with a composure that surprised even me, the kind of calm that rises not from acceptance but from clarity. And though inside I was still reeling from what I had overheard, I knew instinctively that this was not the time to reveal my hand. Michael looked at me expectantly, Clara's eyes flickering with curiosity, as though waiting to see if their carefully delivered ultimatum had finally broken me, and I offered a small smile. lifting my glass of water as though I had been lost in thought and had now returned with measured understanding. I told them I had listened carefully to their suggestions, that I appreciated their honesty, and that I would give it all some serious thought, because appearances, as they had so firmly reminded me, were worth considering. The words rolled smoothly off my tongue, steady, practiced, and I saw the relief flash across their faces, the subtle glance they exchanged, the quiet confirmation between them that their plan was working, and I hid my own relief in that moment. Relief not because of their satisfaction, but because they did not suspect for even a second that my silence was not submission but strategy. The waiter returned with the check, neatly folded in a leather booklet, and without hesitation I reached for it, my hand steady as I slipped my card inside, knowing with certainty that this would be the last time I would ever foot the bill for their comfort. I signed the receipt with my usual precise script, thanked the waiter with a polite nod, and rose from the booth with deliberate calm, my son and daughter-in-law standing just enough to acknowledge my departure, their expressions smug with the belief that they had managed to steer me exactly where they wanted. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, a promise to talk again soon, a shallow smile from Clara, a casual pat on the back from Michael. And then I walked out of that restaurant with a stride that looked ordinary to them, but carried within it the weight of a man who had just shifted the course of his life. The cool night air hit me as I stepped outside, a sharp contrast to the warmth and clamor of the dining room, and I drew in a deep breath, feeling the weight of the evening settle on my shoulders like a heavy coat I would soon shed. I walked to my truck, the familiar creak of its door greeting me, and slid behind the wheel, resting my hands for a moment on the steering wheel as though it were an anchor in a sea of change. The engine rumbled to life, steady and unpretentious, and as I guided the truck through the city streets, neon lights flickering across the windshield, my mind replayed every word spoken at that table, every demand, every laugh I had overheard, and instead of anger, I felt a cold, deliberate resolve crystallizing inside me. The drive home was quiet, the hum of the tires on the asphalt soothing in its familiarity. And though the road stretched long and dark, my thoughts were sharp and clear, focused on what must come next. I no longer needed their approval, their conditional acceptance, their shallow praise, because I had finally seen the truth of who they were, and now the only thing left was to act. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the house standing steady and familiar in the soft glow of the porch light, I knew without doubt that tonight had been the last time I would play the role of silent benefactor. I stepped inside, hung my jacket carefully on the hook, and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the worn wood that had borne the weight of countless dinners, bills, and decisions. And I whispered into the quiet that change had come, not with a shout or a fight, but with the calm certainty of a man who had finally opened his eyes. The next morning, I rose earlier than usual, the kind of early that comes not from rest, but from a mind too alert to stay in bed, and I made myself a strong cup of coffee before settling at the kitchen table with a stack of folders, a legal pad, and the quiet determination of a man finally ready to face the full scope of his choices. The house was still, the sun barely breaking over the horizon, and in that soft golden light I began to pull out the paper trail of 3 years of giving, sorting through bank statements, canceled checks, credit card bills, and receipts. Each piece of paper carrying with it the evidence of how deeply I had entwined my finances with my son's life. At first it felt overwhelming, the pile so high that I wondered how I would ever bring order to it. But as I drew slow lines across the legal pad, marking mortgage payments I had covered, car payments I had made, grocery totals that had quietly left my account. The story began to emerge in stark, undeniable numbers. Month after month, I had transferred funds, never missing a due date, never letting them feel the panic of scarcity, and as I tallied the amounts, the figures grew larger, each total flowing into the next, until the sum began to look less like generosity and more like a second household I had been secretly funding. I added columns for utilities, for insurance premiums I had covered on their behalf, for credit card balances I had quietly erased to keep their credit intact, and by midday, my legal pad was filled with numbers that stretched across the page like a map of exhaustion. When I added the totals together, my breath caught in my throat because the figure staring back at me was not small, not something that could be dismissed as the casual support of a caring parent, but a staggering sum, large enough to have secured my retirement several times over. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling, the weight of realization pressing down on me, and I thought of the vacations I had postponed, the home repairs I had delayed, the hobbies I had never taken up, all so that my son and his wife could live in comfort without ever facing the struggles I had endured. The coffee had long gone cold by the time I turned back to the paperwork, but I kept going, creating binders, labeling folders, building a timeline that laid out in undeniable detail exactly how much of my life had been poured into theirs. There was no anger in the act, no bitterness as the numbers grew, only a kind of clarity, a sense that I was finally holding the truth in my hands rather than allowing it to drift unspoken in the background. By the evening, I had a binder that could have belonged to an accountant, every dollar accounted for, every sacrifice catalogued, and I closed it with the deliberate snap of a man sealing away not only records but years of illusions. I sat there in the fading light of the kitchen, the binder resting on the table like a heavy verdict, and I whispered to myself that the time had come to protect what remained, that I would no longer allow their laughter and manipulation to consume the years I had left. The total was staggering, yes, but it was also liberating, because it told me that I had given enough, more than enough, and that now it was time to turn my energy toward securing the peace and dignity I had postponed for far too long. On Monday morning, I carried the heavy binder of records into a modest office building downtown, the kind of place where law firms occupied quiet corners and the halls smelled faintly of paper and coffee. And as I waited in the reception area, I ran my hand across the worn leather cover, feeling the weight of not only the documents inside, but the years of sacrifice they represented. The lawyer I had chosen was a man recommended by a trusted acquaintance, someone known for his meticulous nature and straightforward manner, and when I was ushered into his office, I was struck by the sense of order that filled the room. Books neatly aligned on shelves, framed certificates on the wall, and a polished desk cleared except for a legal pad and pen waiting for my story. I introduced myself, explained briefly that I was seeking advice on how to protect my finances, and then opened the binder, sliding it across the desk like a confession. He adjusted his glasses, leaned forward, and began flipping through the pages with the careful eye of someone who had seen many such stories. Yet I noticed how his brow furrowed slightly as he tallied the totals, his pen making small notes in the margin. I told him everything. How my son and his wife had relied on me for years, how I had covered their mortgage, car payments, credit cards, groceries, and insurance, and how the total had now grown so large that it represented not just generosity, but the postponement of my own retirement, my own stability, and my own peace. I spoke of the dinner, the confrontation, the humiliation disguised as advice, though I spared him the cruel details of the overheard laughter, keeping my explanation focused on the financial entanglement and the urgent need to separate myself from it. He listened without interruption, occasionally nodding, occasionally jotting down a note, and when I finished, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands, his expression serious but not unkind. He explained that while much of what I had given would likely be considered gifts in the eyes of the law, there were still steps I could take to ensure that no further obligations tied me to their expenses, and that my remaining assets could be protected from misuse. He recommended that I cancel every automatic payment immediately, close any joint accounts, and formally remove my son from insurance policies or retirement accounts where he was listed as a beneficiary, steps that would secure my independence and prevent further drain on my resources. He also suggested drafting updated legal documents, including a will that reflected my true wishes, ensuring that what I left behind would not fall into the hands of those who had shown such disregard for the value of my life's work. As he spoke, I felt a mixture of heaviness and relief, heaviness at the reality that so much had already been lost, but relief in knowing there was still time to draw clear boundaries and preserve the years ahead. He outlined the process, the paperwork required, the agencies to contact, and he offered to guide me through each step if I wished, assuring me that many had stood where I stood, blindsided by the ingratitude of family, yet determined to reclaim their peace. I thanked him sincerely, shook his hand firmly, and left the office with the binder tucked under my arm, the streets outside buzzing with the rush of Monday morning life. But inside me there was a calm resolve, the kind that comes when a man realizes he is no longer powerless, but instead holding the tools to rebuild. As I drove home, I thought not of anger or revenge, but of balance, of setting things right, not through confrontation, but through quiet, deliberate action, and by the time I pulled into my driveway, I knew exactly what I had to do next. That evening, after returning from the lawyer's office, I sat once again at my kitchen table, with the binder of records open before me and a fresh notebook at my side. And for the first time in years I felt not weighed down by the endless stream of bills and obligations, but energized by the clarity of a plan. I drew up a checklist in neat handwriting, each line representing a tie that had bound me to Michael and Clara's lifestyle, and beside each I placed a date, a phone number, and the exact steps required to sever it. The mortgage payment I had been covering for them was at the top of the list, a monthly transfer that had quietly left my account for more than 3 years, and I noted the bank branch I would visit to cancel it. Next came the car loan that I had agreed to co-sign, a decision made in a moment of misplaced trust, and I began drafting the call I would make to the lender to remove my automatic payment authorization, knowing it might take persistence, but determined not to let another dollar slip away. Their credit cards followed, accounts I had once covered to save them from mounting interest, and I collected the card numbers, statement addresses, and customer service contacts, each detail organized with the precision of a soldier preparing for battle. I wrote down the insurance policies too, life and auto and health, each of which I had paid into on their behalf, and I circled them with firm strokes of my pen, determined to reclaim every ounce of security that should have been preserved for my own twilight years. As I filled page after page, the rhythm of the pen steady against paper, I felt a sense of power returning to me. A power not loud or dramatic, but quiet, disciplined, and undeniable, the kind of strength that comes when a man finally recognizes his own worth. I timed everything carefully, calculating which payments were due next, arranging my calls and visits in an order that would maximize efficiency and minimize overlap, and by the time the clock struck midnight, I had built a plan so thorough that I could see the end of the tunnel clearly. The kitchen around me was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator, the old clock ticking on the wall, and I realized that in this silence I was not alone but accompanied by the memory of my wife, who had always admired careful planning, who had once said that foresight was the greatest gift we could give ourselves. I whispered to her then, promising that I was finally doing what she would have wanted, protecting the life we had worked so hard to build instead of letting it drain away into hands that had shown no gratitude. The pages of the notebook grew filled with arrows, underlined notes, and firm deadlines, and when I closed it at last, I felt as though I had closed a chapter of weakness and opened one of resolve. There would be no arguments, no raised voices, no angry confrontations, only action, deliberate and precise, carried out with the patience of a man who had nothing left to prove but everything left to protect. I stacked the binder and notebook neatly on the table, turned off the kitchen light, and walked to bed with a calm heart, knowing that when morning came, the first calls would be made, and the unraveling of years of dependence would begin not with a shout, but with the steady hand of a father who had finally chosen himself. The next morning dawned, bright and cool, and I rose with the kind of resolve that only comes once a decision has hardened fully in a man's heart. Brewing coffee strong enough to steady me for the day ahead before laying out my binder and notebook once more, each page like a map leading me step by step toward freedom. I began with the bank, walking through the heavy glass doors with my papers neatly organized, greeting the teller with the same calm politeness I had always shown, and explaining firmly that I wished to cancel the automatic transfers that had been moving money into my son's mortgage account each month, and though she raised her eyebrows in mild surprise, she carried out my request without hesitation, the click of her keyboard sounding like the quiet snapping of chains I had carried too long. From there I called the car loan company, reciting the account number with steady precision. And after enduring the scripted questions of the representative, I confirmed the cancellation of my authorization, smiling faintly, as I realized that next month, when Michael expected the payment to clear, it would not. The credit card companies were next, and I moved from one to the other with patient determination, closing accounts I had been linked to, removing myself as payer, ensuring that not a single balance could be shifted onto my shoulders again. The insurance policies took more time, requiring transfers between departments and the signing of updated forms, but I pressed through, speaking clearly, asking for confirmations, and writing down reference numbers until I was certain that every thread had been cut, every tie severed. By midday, I had already crossed half the items from my list, and I stopped only briefly for a sandwich at my kitchen table, the quiet hum of the house around me serving as a reminder that peace was built not in grand gestures, but in these deliberate, careful steps. In the afternoon, I turned to matters that carried more weight, matters of legacy, and I called my lawyer to finalize the changes we had discussed, updating my will, so that my estate would pass not to those who had mocked my sacrifices, but to charities and causes that would honor the values I had lived by, causes that would ensure my work carried meaning long after I was gone. We removed Michael entirely from my accounts, stripped his name from policies where once I had listed him automatically, and as the papers were notarized and filed, I felt a strange lightness in my chest, as though with every signature I was reclaiming years I thought I had already lost. The final step was to close the joint account I had once opened to make transfers easier, an account that had been drained countless times at his request, and when the teller handed me the closing slip, I folded it carefully into my binder, a symbol of finality that needed no further explanation. By evening the work was done, the loose ends tied, the knots tightened, and I sat in my living room as the sun dipped low, the golden light spilling across the floorboards, while I reflected on how much had changed in a single day. My son and his wife were out there, living their lives unaware that the current carrying them forward had just been cut off at the source. And while they might not yet feel the shift, the ripples of it would soon reach them, and they would have to swim on their own. I poured myself a glass of water, raised it slightly in the air as though toasting the silence, and whispered that this was not revenge but renewal, a necessary act of preservation, and with that thought I settled into my chair, tired but deeply at peace, knowing that I had finally secured my future with my own hands. It was only a matter of time before the silence on my end reached them, and 3 weeks later the phone rang on a gray Tuesday morning, just as I was sitting on the porch with a newspaper and a mug of tea, the quiet hum of birdsong around me, contrasting sharply with the frantic tone of Michael's voice on the line. He did not begin with pleasantries, did not even bother with the usual half-hearted greetings, but launched straight into panic, demanding to know why the mortgage payment had bounced, why the car loan had gone unpaid, why the credit card company had suddenly frozen accounts that had always been covered without question. His words tumbled over one another in a rush, sharp with confusion but layered with arrogance, as though these disruptions were not the natural consequence of years of dependency, but a temporary inconvenience I was somehow obligated to fix. I listened quietly, the receiver warm against my ear, letting him spill his frustration without interrupting, noting how even in panic he spoke not with humility, but with entitlement, his voice carrying the assumption that I must have made some mistake, that surely I had overlooked a transfer or forgotten to sign a check. When he paused for breath, I answered only with calm acknowledgement, a simple, "I heard you," nothing more, and that seemed to unsettle him, for he repeated his questions more loudly, adding accusations now, suggesting that perhaps I was slipping in my old age, that maybe I needed him to take more direct control of my finances to keep things in order. I let the insult pass without reaction, keeping my voice measured as I told him that I would look into it, words chosen carefully to neither confirm nor deny. And the silence that followed on his end was heavy with impatience. Clara's voice rose faintly in the background, sharp and scolding, urging him to press harder, and he returned to the line with the demand that I sort things out immediately, that I could not let them fall behind because their reputation depended on staying current, because their friends would notice if the car was repossessed or if a foreclosure notice appeared on the door. I closed my eyes as he spoke, picturing the binder on my desk, the neatly checked boxes of every account I had severed, and felt no regret, only a steady calm that reminded me why I had done it. I told him again, with a firmness he could not mistake, that I would think about what he had said and that I would be in touch when I had an answer. And before he could argue further, I ended the call, setting the phone gently on the table beside my chair. The morning air was cool, the tea still steaming, and as I turned back to my newspaper, I felt the corners of my mouth lift ever so slightly, not in triumph, but in quiet satisfaction, because for the first time in years the weight of their demands did not rest on me, and the world around me, from the rustle of leaves to the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, seemed brighter for it. The second call came only a few days later, this time in the evening, when the sky was painted in shades of fading orange and the cicadas had begun their steady chorus outside my window. And though I saw Michael's name flash across the screen with the urgency of someone who had run out of patience, I let it ring twice before answering, steadying my voice into the calm tone I had practiced silently in my mind. He wasted no time, launching straight into demands again, his words sharper now, his panic masked poorly by anger, and he accused me of abandoning them, of letting things collapse, of failing in the role he had grown to believe was mine by default, the role of silent provider. Clara's voice cut in from the background, high and frantic, and I could hear her urging him to insist harder, to remind me of my so-called responsibility, to push until I caved the way they expected I always would. But this time I did not let his words dictate the rhythm of the conversation. I listened with a patience born not of submission, but of resolve, letting him burn through his fury until at last there was a pause. The kind of pause that begged to be filled, and in that space I delivered the words I had been saving. I told him, slowly and clearly, that I had taken his advice to heart, that I had thought long and hard about the image I was presenting, and that I had decided to upgrade my lifestyle, but not in the way he imagined. I said I had upgraded to a life without the weight of ungrateful demands, a life where my hard-earned money served my needs and dreams, rather than propping up those who mocked me behind my back. I explained that I had ended the payments, not out of spite but out of clarity, because their words at dinner had shown me exactly how they valued me, and I had realized that the only image worth preserving was the one I saw when I looked at myself in the mirror, a man who had given enough. There was silence on the line then, so complete that I could hear the faint hum of the cicadas through the open window. And for a moment I thought the call might have dropped, but then Michael's voice returned, sputtering with disbelief, his anger cracking into desperation as he demanded to know if I was serious, if I truly meant to cut them off. I assured him that I was, that the bank transfers were finished, the credit cards canceled, the accounts closed, the insurance policies updated, and my will rewritten, and that nothing he said could undo what had already been done. Clara's voice rose again, furious now, calling me selfish, short-sighted, accusing me of turning my back on family. But I did not let the words touch me, for I knew they came not from love, but from fear, the fear of losing the easy life they had built on my shoulders. I told them one last thing, my voice steady, my tone free of malice, that they had freed me without realizing it, that by showing me what they truly thought, they had given me permission to live the rest of my years on my own terms. And then, before their voices could rise again, I ended the call, placing the phone gently on the table beside me. Outside, the sun slipped fully below the horizon, the sky deepening into twilight, and I sat there in the growing dark with a peace I had not felt in decades, knowing that the most powerful statement I had ever made required no shouting, no anger, only the quiet certainty of a man who had finally chosen himself. It was late on a Saturday morning when I heard the sound of tires crunching against the gravel of my driveway, a hurried rhythm that broke the usual quiet of my home, and as I glanced out the front window, I saw Michael's car pull in with a sharp stop, the doors swinging open almost before the engine had settled. Clara climbed out first, her heels striking the ground with quick, angry clicks, her face tight with a mix of panic and indignation, and Michael followed close behind, his jaw set, but his eyes betraying the exhaustion of sleepless nights and mounting pressure. I opened the door before they had a chance to knock, not out of eagerness but out of calm control, greeting them with a measured nod that seemed to unsettle them more than if I had met them with anger. They began speaking at once, their voices overlapping, Michael demanding answers and Clara pleading in tones that wavered between desperation and accusation. They spoke of missed mortgage payments, of calls from the bank, of credit cards now useless, and a car loan on the verge of repossession, their words tumbling out like stones in a landslide, heavy and relentless. Clara's voice cracked as she said foreclosure was looming, that the life they had built was crumbling. And then she turned her words sharper, accusing me of cruelty, of abandoning them when they needed me most, while Michael paced at the edge of the porch, his fists clenching and unclenching as he alternated between blaming me and begging me to reconsider. I listened in silence, my hands folded loosely in front of me, feeling the weight of their performance, the way their voices rose and fell as though rehearsed, one moment filled with fury, the next dripping with supplication, a cycle meant to break me down the way it always had. Michael's tone softened suddenly, his shoulders slumping as he reminded me of childhood memories, of times when I had promised I would always be there for him, his eyes wide, with a practiced vulnerability that might once have stirred me into action, but now rang hollow after the truth I had overheard at the restaurant. Clara stepped closer then, her voice trembling as she said they were on the edge of ruin, that friends were beginning to notice, that they could not bear the humiliation of losing the image they had worked so hard to maintain, and her hand reached for mine as though a physical connection might bridge the gap their words could not. I did not pull away, but neither did I respond, standing steady as they circled me with their alternating waves of anger and pleading, their desperation filling the air so thickly that it seemed to press against the walls of the house. Inside, my heart was calm, because I knew this storm was not mine to weather, not anymore. And while I felt the echoes of the fatherly instinct that had carried me for decades, I also felt the clarity that told me enough was enough. Their voices rose louder, Michael finally breaking into a shout, demanding to know how I could do this to him after all he had been through, Clara echoing his words with frantic energy. And I let the sound wash over me like wind against stone, unmoved, unbroken, waiting for the storm to exhaust itself. Eventually their voices faltered, the anger burning into weariness, the pleading slipping into silence, and I met their eyes one by one, seeing not children in need, but adults facing the reality of choices they had long avoided. Without raising my voice, I told them to leave, my words quiet but firm, and though Michael sputtered in disbelief and Clara's eyes filled with tears, they seemed to recognize that nothing they said could shift me. They turned slowly back to the car, their movements heavy with defeat, and as the tires rolled once more across the gravel, I closed the door gently behind me, the house settling into silence once again. A silence, not empty, but filled with the strength of resolve. The next evening the knock came again, slower this time, almost hesitant, and when I opened the door, Michael and Clara stood there with expressions that looked less polished than before, their clothes wrinkled, their eyes ringed with fatigue, their confidence drained by the reality of bills piling high without relief, and for the first time in years, I saw them stripped of the image they had worked so hard to project. They began again with soft voices, Michael asking if we could talk, Clara nodding with a pleading look, and though I might once have been softened by such gestures, and this time I motioned for them to sit in the living room while I remained standing, because I needed them to hear me, not as the father they thought they could manipulate, but as the man who had finally reclaimed his voice. Michael started first, apologizing in a halting way that sounded rehearsed, his words tumbling out about how things had gotten out of hand, how maybe they had pushed too hard, and Clara chimed in with agreement, her tone shifting between contrition and justification, as though the right mix of sorrow and excuses might undo what had already been revealed. I listened in silence until their words ran dry, until the room was heavy with the expectation that I would finally bend, and then I told them the truth I had carried since that night at the restaurant, the truth that had burned in my chest every time I replayed their laughter in my mind. I said I had overheard everything, that when I excused myself to the restroom, I had stood in the hallway long enough to hear their voices mocking me, laughing at the look on my face, planning how they would milk me for a few more years before cutting me off entirely. And that in that moment the illusion of family had shattered for me. Their faces changed instantly, Clara paling as though she had been struck, Michael's jaw tightening as though searching for a way to deny it, but I pressed on, my voice steady and clear. I told them that for years I had given without question, that I had sacrificed vacations, hobbies, and comforts so that they could build a life without struggle, and that I had done it not for recognition but out of love, yet the very love I had poured into them had been met with manipulation and contempt. I told them that they had shown me who they truly were that night, that I no longer had to wonder whether their gratitude was sincere because their own words had revealed the truth. Clara stammered then, insisting that I must have misheard, that it had been a joke taken out of context, but her voice wavered under the weight of her own memory, and Michael tried to regain control, his tone growing sharper as he demanded to know if I would really throw away family over one overheard conversation. I looked him in the eye and answered simply that I was not throwing anything away, that they had already done that themselves, and that all I was doing now was acknowledging the reality they had created. The silence that followed was deeper than any argument, the kind of silence that exposes the futility of words when truth has already spoken louder than denial ever could. I walked to the front door then, opened it wide, and told them calmly that this chapter of our relationship was closed, that I wished them the strength to face the consequences of their choices, but that I would no longer carry them through the storm. Clara's eyes brimmed with tears as she stood. Michael's face hardened into a mask of pride and anger, and together they walked past me, their footsteps heavy on the porch, their figures fading into the night as I closed the door gently behind them. I leaned against the wood for a moment, breathing deeply, and felt a profound stillness settle over me. Not the emptiness of loss, but the peace of finality, the knowledge that I had spoken the truth, drawn the line, and reclaimed my life once and for all. 6 months later, I found myself standing on the deck of a ferry, gliding across a wide blue bay, the salty wind brushing against my face, the horizon stretched endlessly before me. And for the first time in decades, my heart felt light enough to soar with it. The past half year had been a season of renewal, each day stitched together not by obligations or bills, but by choices made freely, choices that belonged to me alone. With the money I once funneled into supporting Michael and Clara's lifestyle, I booked trips to places I had only ever seen in magazines, wandered cobblestone streets in old towns where no one knew my name, tasted foods so rich with flavor they seemed to rewrite my memories of simpler meals, and met people whose kindness came without conditions or demands. My house had grown quieter, yes, but it was a quiet that healed rather than suffocated, filled with books waiting to be read, music echoing softly through the rooms, and evenings spent watching the sun dip behind familiar hills, while I sipped tea without a single thought of overdue transfers or late-night calculations. Letters still arrived occasionally from Michael, sometimes curt, sometimes desperate, sometimes filled with apologies that sounded as rehearsed as his old speeches, and once or twice I received messages from Clara, their tone swinging wildly between anger and pleading, but I read them only briefly before tucking them away in a drawer, not out of cruelty but out of a calm recognition that their words no longer held power over me. I felt no bitterness when I saw their names, only a distant ache, like the memory of a scar that had long since healed, because I had already said goodbye in my heart the night I closed the door on them, And every day since had proven that peace was possible once you choose to value yourself above the manipulations of others. Friends I had not seen in years re-entered my life. As I reached out again, neighbors stopped by for coffee, and on my travels I met new companions who shared stories and laughter without ever asking for more than company. My retirement fund, once drained to support someone else's comfort, now blossomed into the security it was always meant to provide, and I used it not for extravagance but for joy, for the simple experiences that stitch together a meaningful life. I thought often of my wife, of the promise I had made to protect our son, and though it pained me that the story had not unfolded the way we once dreamed, I knew she would have understood. She would have told me that peace is sometimes found not in holding on, but in letting go. And I carried that wisdom with me into every sunrise I witnessed on unfamiliar shores. Standing there on the ferry, watching gulls wheel above the water, I whispered a quiet thank you to the life I had reclaimed, to the strength I had found in silence, and to the truth that had set me free. I no longer lived with the weight of demands or the ache of humiliation, only with the steady beat of my own heart reminding me that even in later years, new beginnings are possible. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.